Hey everyone, and welcome to History Unlocked, the podcast where we take a deep dive into stories from the past. I'm Mr MacAulay, and in this series, we're taking a trip back about 5,000 years to explore one of the most fascinating civilizations in all of human history, ancient Egypt. But here's the twist. We're not talking about pyramids and mummies today. We're going to uncover a secret ingredient that made ancient Egypt so incredibly successful for over 3,000 years. And that secret ingredient? It's geography. That's right, the land itself. Think about it. Egypt lasted longer than any civilization before or since. The Roman Empire? About 500 years. The British Empire? Maybe 200 years at its peak. But Egypt? We're talking about a civilization that thrived from around 3100 BCE to 30 BCE. That's longer than Christianity has existed. So what made them so special? Was it their technology, their leaders, their army? Well, all of those things helped, and we'll talk about them in another episode. But the real answer lies in where they lived and how they used their environment to their advantage. So let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're playing a strategy game like Civilization or Age of Empires. You get to pick where your civilization starts. What would you look for? Well, definitely water. You need that for drinking and farming. Maybe some natural defenses so other players can't attack you easily. Good soil for growing food, and probably some natural resources you can trade with other civilizations. Ancient Egypt hit the geographic jackpot. They basically spawned in the perfect starting location, and let me break down why. The Nile. The Nile River. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, great. Another history lesson about a river. But seriously, the Nile wasn't just any river. This thing was like nature's perfect life support system. The Nile is the longest river in the world, over 4,000 miles long. But here's what made it special for Egyptians. It was incredibly predictable. Every single year, like clockwork, it would flood. And not destructive floods like you might see on the news. These were gentle, life-giving floods that happened at exactly the right time. Picture this. Every July, the river would slowly rise and spread across the land, leaving behind this incredibly rich, dark soil called silt. The Egyptians called this rich soil the Black Land, and for good reason. When you see pictures of Egypt today, it's all sand and desert, right? But along the Nile, it was this narrow strip of the most fertile farmland that you can imagine. Here's a crazy fact that'll blow your mind. Even today, you can literally see Egypt from space because of this. There's this thin green line cutting through the beige desert. That's the Nile Valley. It's like nature drew a line and said, this is where civilization happens. So imagine you're an ancient Egyptian farmer. You don't have to worry about when to plant, whether it'll rain. The Nile's got you covered. Every year, flood in July, plant in October when the waters recede, harvest in March and April. Rinse and repeat for thousands of years. This predictability was huge. In other parts of the world, people were constantly worried about droughts, floods at the wrong time, or bad harvests, but Egyptians, they could plan ahead. They could build up surpluses. They could free up people to do other things besides just survive. And that's the key. When you don't have everyone working just to get enough food, you can have specialists. People who become really good at one thing, like making pottery or building or governing or creating art. This is how you get the incredible Egyptian achievements we still marvel at today. Speaking of building, let's talk about those pyramids that everyone loves. You know why they could build such massive monuments? Because their geography gave them both the materials and the workforce. The Nile wasn't just good for farming. It was like an ancient superhighway. You could load huge stone blocks onto boats and float them right where you needed them to be. Try dragging those multi-ton stones across land without the river. It would take forever and cost way more resources. And the limestone and granite they needed? Right there in the cliffs along the Nile Valley. It's like the whole area was designed for monument building. The ancient Egyptians had quarries at places like Aswan, where they could cut out massive granite blocks, load them onto boats, and float them hundreds of miles north to wherever they needed to be building. But it wasn't just about moving stones. The Nile connected the entire country. A pharaoh in Memphis could send messages, troops, or trade goods to the far south of the kingdom just by putting them on a boat. Going upstream, you'd use the current. Going downstream, you'd use the sails and wind. It was brilliantly effective. Here's something even cooler about Egypt's location. Its natural defenses. Egypt was surrounded by what they called the Red Land, basically impossible deserts that protected them like massive walls. To the east and west, you had these huge deserts that were incredibly difficult to cross. We're talking about the Sahara Desert to the west, the largest hot desert in the world, and the Eastern Desert leading to the Red Sea. These weren't just inconvenient, they were deadly if you didn't know what you were doing. To the south, you had the cataracts, basically a series of rapids and waterfalls that made the Nile unnavigable for long stretches. Think of them like natural toll booths that were really hard to get past. And to the north, you had the Mediterranean Sea, which was great for trade, but also meant invaders would have to mount a naval invasion. So Egypt was like this natural fortress. It was really hard for enemies to invade, which meant they could develop their culture and technology without constantly fighting off attackers. This protection was so effective that for the first 2,000 years of Egyptian civilization, they barely had to deal with foreign invasions. Can you imagine how much you could accomplish if you had 2,000 years of peace? That's why Egyptian art and culture stayed so consistent for so long. They weren't constantly being disrupted by wars and invasions like other civilizations. Geography didn't just protect them. It also connected them to the wider world when they wanted to trade. The Nile Delta, where the river meets the Mediterranean, became this huge trading hub. Think about Egypt's position on the map. It's literally the bridge between Africa and the Middle East, and by extension, Europe. Egyptian merchants could sail up the Nile to get goods from the interior of Africa, things like gold, ivory, exotic animals, incense, ebony wood. Then they could sail across the Mediterranean to trade with Greece or overland to Mesopotamia. This made Egypt incredibly wealthy. They weren't just farming and building monuments, they were like the Amazon of the ancient world, connecting buyers and sellers across 3 continents. The Egyptians traded their grain. Remember they had those really reliable harvests? Well, they'd trade their grain for luxury goods, metals they didn't have locally, and ideas from other cultures. This wealth allowed them to support their massive building projects and their complex government system. But let's talk more specifically about the Delta, because it was absolutely crucial to Egyptian success. As the Nile approaches the Mediterranean Sea, it splits into multiple channels, creating this triangular area of incredibly fertile land. The Greeks called it a delta because it looked like their letter delta, a triangle. This delta region was like Egypt's breadbasket, but on steroids. All that rich silt from the entire length of the Nile River got deposited here. It was so fertile that it could support incredibly dense populations. Some historians estimate the Nile Delta alone could feed several million people in ancient times. And having this agricultural powerhouse meant that Egypt could support large cities, massive construction projects, and a complex bureaucracy. Most ancient civilizations struggled to feed more than a few 100,000 people, but Egypt could easily support millions. Egypt's geography didn't just give them protection and farmland, it gave them incredible natural resources that other civilizations had to trade for or fight wars to get. Gold came from the deserts to the east and south. In fact, the Egyptian word for gold, Nebu, became the root word for Nubia, the land to the south that was rich in gold mines. The pharaohs controlled these mines and became incredibly wealthy. Copper and turquoise came from the Sinai Peninsula. Limestone and sandstone for building were everywhere along the Nile Valley. They had clay for pottery, reeds for making papyrus, and even natron, a natural salt that was perfect for mummification. It's like they won the natural resources lottery. While other civilizations had to trade extensively just to get basic materials, Egypt had almost everything they needed right at home. So the way Egypt's geography shaped their entire calendar and society is simply fascinating. The Egyptian year was built around the Nile's flood cycle, and this created a rhythm that allowed their civilization to flourish. They had 3 seasons. They had Akhet, the flooding season, Peret, the growing season, and Shemu, the harvest season. During Akhet, when the land was flooded, farmers couldn't work the fields. But guess what? This is when they worked on the pyramids and other monuments. The flood season became construction season. Think about how genius this is. In most societies, people are either farming or they're not eating. But in Egypt, the flood cycle meant there was a natural downtime from agriculture that could be used for other projects. This is part of how they could mobilize huge workforces for their incredible building projects. During Peret, everyone was planting and tending crops, and during Shemu, it was all hands on deck, harvest time. But then the cycle would repeat, giving them another construction season. Even Egypt's climate was perfect for civilization building. The Mediterranean climate in the north was mild and pleasant, while the desert climate in the south was dry, but not unbearably hot along the river. This dry climate was actually a huge advantage in some ways. It naturally preserved things, which is why we have so many incredible artifacts from ancient Egypt today, including mummies that are thousands of years old. In a wet climate, all that stuff would have rotted away centuries ago. The dry air made it easier to store grain and other foods for long periods of time. Egypt could build up massive food surpluses that would last through bad years or could be traded for other goods. Here's something really cool about the Nile that helped create Egyptian political unity. Unlike other river systems that branch out into lots of tributaries, the Nile in Egypt is basically one river flowing north through a narrow valley. This geography naturally encouraged a political unity. It was easy for one ruler to control the entire river valley because it was essentially a single corridor. Compare this to Mesopotamia, where multiple rivers created multiple power centers and almost constant warfare between different city-states. The Egyptians developed this concept of Upper Egypt, actually in the south, but further upstream, and Lower Egypt, which was in the north, but was downstream. And the pharaohs wore a double crown, symbolizing their rule over both regions. But really, it was all one river valley that naturally belonged together. Of course, Egypt's geographic advantages didn't last forever, and understanding why is just as interesting as understanding their success. Around 1200 BCE, the climate started changing. The Nile's floods became less predictable. Sometimes they were too high and destroyed the crops, sometimes they were too low and there wasn't enough water for farming. At the same time, other civilizations had developed better transportation and military technology. Those protective deserts became less of a barrier when people had ways to cross them. Iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots made it easier for outsiders to invade. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been Egypt's connection to trade, also became a highway for invaders. The Sea Peoples, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally the Romans all came knocking on the door. But think about this. Even when Egypt was conquered by outsiders, they often adopted Egyptian ways of doing things because the geography still favoured the Egyptian system. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he founded Alexandria as a Greek city, but it was built right there in the Nile Delta to take advantage of the same geographic advantages the pharaohs had used for thousands of years. So, what can we learn from ancient Egypt's geographic success story? Well, first it shows us how incredibly important environment and location are for civilizations. Egypt succeeded not just because they were smart or organized, though they were definitely both, but because they were in the right place at the right time. It also shows us how geography shapes culture. Egyptian art, religion, and society were all deeply influenced by the rhythm of the Nile floods, the presence of the desert, and their position between different continents. But maybe most importantly, it shows us that even the best geographic advantages don't last forever. Climates change, technology advances, and what once seemed like perfect natural defenses can become irrelevant. Egypt teaches us that successful civilizations are the ones that make the most of their geographic advantages while they have them, and that adapt to those advantages when they change. So there you have it. The real secret behind one of history's most successful civilizations. It wasn't just pharaohs and pyramids that made ancient Egypt great. It was the Nile River providing reliable floods and transportation, the deserts providing protection, the location providing trade opportunities, and the resources providing wealth. Geography gave ancient Egypt the foundation they needed to build a civilization that lasted for over 3,000 years. They took those natural advantages and built something incredible. A culture that still fascinates us today, monuments that still amaze us, and innovations that still influence us. So next time you see a picture of the pyramids or a mummy in a museum, remember that behind all of that human achievement was one of the best pieces of real estate in the entire world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Egypt's geographic advantages. I'm Mr MacAulay, and this has been History Unlocked.